Why don't you tell us a little bit about where you were born and who your parents were, and you were born in Philadelphia to...
Okay. How do you work this?
It's on.
What do I
It's
do
recording. You just talk. It'll pick it up from where you are.
right now?
Listen. So say
I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
here, I'll just show you where we're...
Born at home, as most people, in fact, all people were then. My mother was Mary Elizabeth Martin Donnelly, and my dad was Edward Thomas Donnelly. He was he installed pipe organs for a company named Austin Organ. But when I was born, he decided to go into business for himself because I was his third child. I had two older brothers, one 8 years older, Ed, and one 6 years older, Jack. And, of course, his family growing, he decided to take a chance in going into business. He was successful. And, of course, I got credit for it. So, they were really wonderful people. Very loving. And my dad was hardworking. He could do anything. In fact, the house that they bought, the house in which I was born, did not have electricity when he moved in, and he electrified the house in his spare time. My mother often said all she wanted was a baby girl and a player piano. When she got me, she also got the player piano from my father. She played the piano herself. I suppose that was a new invention or something. They had rolls that they put on the piano. And for years we had it and had a wonderful time with it. We used to have parties and sing along and everything with the player piano. I later had a brother, Paul. He's 3 years younger than I am, and that finished our family. At that point, about a year after Paul was born, we moved to what was West Oak Lane.
What year was that?
That was about 1926.
And you were born in 21.
And I was born in 21. Paul was born in 24. And I remember when we moved in, the drifts of snow were about 3 feet high going up our front steps. They had to shovel their way into the house. It was an interesting neighborhood. Because we were a new development, we were cut into the side of a hill. And they called the street that went down from the hill Goat Hill. And there was a driveway next to my house, and on that drive there was a stone wall. And on the stone wall was a big red old barn and a windmill. And it was very fascinating. About a block or two away was a nice house, and we used to hear the sound of them making ice, and it sounded like the ocean at the seashore. So it was really interesting.
But it was Olney, or West Oak Lane at that time was a...
Very small area.
The outskirts of the city?
Yes it was, because we could walk up, well, it was a good hike, but we would walk up to what was the city limits, and there was a Boy Scout camp up there. Years later, there was a shopping mall up on that area. Cheltenham Shopping Center. And we had a dog when I was, I don't know. I guess we got our dog Boots when I was about 10 or 11 years old. And I used to walk her up to the city limits and back. And as she got older and she wasn't too well, sometimes I had to carry her home. So I didn't do that too often because she was a medium-sized dog, probably weighed 50 pounds. So no more of that. I was a tomboy growing up. I just loved having my 3 brothers. And I was into everything with them. Or if not with them, the same sort of things they would do. In those days, the boys wore what they called knickers, which were pants that came tight right below the knee and were kind of baggy. And I used to put on an old pair of my brother's knickers, which were large, and fill them up with rags from the rag bag to go play football with the boys. That was my equipment. That was all the equipment any of the kids had then. I played baseball until I was 12, and then with the boys. And my mother told me she didn't think it was very ladylike, so I stopped playing with the boys at that age.
Were you ready to stop playing by the age of 12, or would you have?
Well, the boys got a little funny then. But we roller skated, and the surrounding territory, there were a lot of homes going up, and there were streets, but there was no traffic on it because the houses weren't finished yet. There wasn't much traffic on the streets in those days anyway, and we could roller skate, up and down hills, a wonderful time. And all ages roller skated together. I mean, from the 7 years old to teenagers. And we had a wonderful time. Cars were always, we had a garage, so our car was always put in the garage. We were among the first to get a car. We got a car in 26, right after we moved up there.
What kind of car?
It was a blue Pontiac, 4-door, of course. Beautiful. It even had a vase on the side of the back seat. And my mother had put artificial flowers in it. My dad was very knowledgeable about mechanics. And every time he'd take the car out, he'd be back in the garage with the hood up. And I used to say he dusted it every time he used it. But he did something, adjusting this or that, And he could tell just by the sound of it if it were running the way he would like it to run. And there were maybe about 4 other men along the row of houses who had cars. And on Saturday afternoon, they'd all be out there with their hoods up and checking with one another. And it was really their hobby. There weren't too many cars. And they would never leave them out front. They would always put them in the garage.
When you were 10 years old, so.
We did a lot of hiking. And we had streams around. And I remember we used to go collect tadpoles. And I brought tadpoles home, and my mother made me take them back. She said they shouldn't be taken away from their mother, that they were babies. So back I took them. And I guess Catherine would make me take them back now, too, wouldn't she?
Right, she would.
She wouldn't approve. And she would have liked my mother. My mother was a very gentle kind of woman, but she was a happy woman. She used to dance and sing around, and we had a real good time. And I always thought she was very pretty. And my dad thought so, too. You could tell. And she thought he was wonderful.
What about for family entertainment? When in the evenings, or if your dad had a day off and wanted to spend it with the family, what sort of things would you do?
My dad didn't have too many days off. The men then didn't. Most people worked at least Saturday morning, if not all day Saturday. I don't think the 40-hour a week was in yet. And my dad rarely went away on a vacation. He would take us down to the seashore. And we may have even gone down by train. I know we took a trunk to the seashore. We were going, say, for a month. And when we would go out on the boardwalk at night, we had to be dressed up. And I remember white shoes and a white coat that we would wear, and my mother would be dressed. A lot of the women wore jewels on the boardwalk. And this was mostly Atlantic City. This is when Atlantic City was in its heyday. And they had clubs, they called them. I'm sure they were speakeasies. But they also had entertainment. And I guess a lot of these people, like Ella Fitzgerald and the like, got their starts in clubs like that. Mm-hmm. And that's the reason why the gangsters had such a big part in the entertainment business. We used to go to a swimming pool called Forest Park, on picnics. We were great on picnics. My mother drove. She was one of the few women who drove a car. My dad had taken a partner. When I was 9 months old, he had gotten pneumonia. And in those days, they didn't have antibiotics and everything. And he was a long time getting over pneumonia. I think he was like 6 weeks. And not very strong when he did recover. And he did recover, though, and most people didn't. He never smoked after that. He took in a partner.
Your mother smoked, though.
He took in a partner, and the partner's name was Carl Rassman. And he and Carl used to alternate on taking their cars for work, so that my mother had a car every other day. And in the summertime, she would take us on picnics and take us swimming and what have you. We had running boards on the car, and I remember we had a little folding fence that we kind of attached to the running board, and we could put all our equipment in there, our lunch and whatever. They must have had trunks on the cars. I think only the real sporty models had trunks. And but we had plenty of room. And I'm trying to think, there was something I wanted to say about my dad, and I forgot what it was. Anywho, my mother didn't have a father who was around, didn't have a father to support them. He kind of left early. And when she got my father, he took such good care of her that she was just so thrilled with him anyway. And I think he was the catch of the neighborhood. He was 10.5 years older than she was. And his mother thought he was robbing the cradle. But they had a very wonderful marriage, and it worked out very well.
Were you aware of being Irish?
No. My father once said his father was born, parents were born in Ireland. He was born, of course, in this country. He was born in Kansas. And
this country being the United States.
United States. He once said that when his father died, he quit the ancient order of Hibernians. Apparently he had belonged with his dad. And I think a lot of new immigrants do that. You know, they join some group where they're with their people from the same country they came from. But no, he said he wasn't Irish. He was American, and that was it. And we never talked about it, you know. I guess it was bad enough we were Catholic. I wasn't too aware that there was so much bigotry about Catholics, but there was. But then at the same time, we were supposed to avoid Protestants and Jewish people, and I went to parochial school, so all my friends were Catholic, and when I went to work, that's a funny thing, finally at 18 when I went to work, I went to a place where the boss was Jewish, and a good many of the bosses were, and the people working there were, and I learned how nice these people were, and I hadn't ever been told they were awful. I don't know what I was told, really. We just stay with your own kind was probably what we were told. But I think in all the time, in all my years, I think I dated 2 Protestant boys. And I didn't date them very long. I didn't date a whole lot anyway. We always traveled in a crowd. Mm-hmm. You know, we'd have a crowd at my house.
What's your most vivid memory of kind of a family situation or crisis, or from when you were preteen?
I don't recall crises too much. We always had people at our house. We had that old player piano. Mm-hmm. And we had a few people that would bang away on it and we'd sing. Or we would play the radio and we would dance. I remember one time, now my mother and dad used to go for Sunday rides. That was always a big deal. He went for a ride on Sunday. And when we were kids, we had to go with them. But when we got older, we didn't. And my brother Jack would have his fraternity brothers from high school to the house. They were great on playing pinochle. And I would have my girlfriends to the house at the same time. And I remember one Sunday, somebody, I don't know who started it, started to play craps. And the next thing you know, we're all playing. It was fun. And my brother said, we have to watch out for this. You know, we hear that car coming and we can't get caught playing crap. Well, we're standing there playing, then the next thing you know, we hear this voice making bets that we didn't know how to make. It was my father. He knew more about craps than we did. So, and then we'd have a Sunday night supper. And if we didn't have enough left over from the roast or the chicken or whatever, we'd get cold cuts and what have you in. And there was a cake we used to buy at the Delicatessen. Delicatessen was open on Sunday afternoon because people ate Sunday dinner at noon and then had Sunday supper at night. So that way we could always feed a lot of people, and we did. And I remember we used to go around to the movies. We went around to the movies one night, and it was a windy night, and one of the girls, Ruth Wiseman, her hat blew off, and one of the fellas, Bill Nolan, chased her hat, and Ruth tackled him right out on the main drag. Yeah, not too long after that, they got married. So it worked out pretty good for them.
When you were 8, I guess, the Depression started and got worse.
Yeah.
And yet your childhood, you don't really talk much about the Depression. It didn't seem to affect your family so much. How much did it affect it, and how much did you see of what was going on around you?
Well, as far as my family were concerned, my dad told us we had to tighten up a little bit, and we didn't go to the shore for a month, the way we had been. And that's about it. I don't remember any doing without, but people did. And of course, there were people selling apples, men selling apples on the corner, but that would be mostly in the downtown area. You know, they wouldn't be up in the residential place where I lived. Mm-hmm. And so I was not too aware of the Depression. I was very fortunate. My dad worked mostly for churches, but he also had the Curtis Institute of Music, and he had the Irvine Auditorium at the University of Penn and places like that. He had all the biggest organs in the city under his care. Now, these people paid, but they were slow sometimes paying. Right. And I do know that with their mortgage, they didn't pay, they only paid off the interest on the mortgage, so that they never reduced the principal. And it was a long time before people got FHA mortgages that they could pay off the principal too. But that was the only thing. As I say, we had cars.
Well, was this paying only the only the interest? Was this a common thing, or was this only because of the Depression that people were? Was it a special provision made?
I think it may have been only because of the Depression. I don't know.
Did you see a lot of hobos or men out of work or?
No, because I didn't leave my neighborhood.
Right.
As I told the kids last night, we had workmen around there because there were houses being built.
Right.
And then they seemed to stop being built for a little bit, and then they picked up and started again. So I would think that was part of it, the financial end of it. They had to wait until they had more money or hope of selling them. I do remember that I took a lunch, and I was only little then, and I took that lunch and ate it. And that was a workman. He was raising some of these old houses up on the top of the hill. Funny thing is, Mark Quinn's father grew up down that Goat Hill. I didn't know him. And he was enough younger than me that I wouldn't know him. Even his sister, I think, was about 2 or 3 years younger than I am. And but it was fun. But I remember one time we had a great big field of daisies. Another girl, 2 girls, and I were down picking daisies. And the Goat Hill gang came along. Now, these were a bunch of Italian kids that lived down Goat Hill. And they kidnapped the 2 girls, and they took the 2 girls off. And they said, "Don't take her," meaning me. "That's Donnelly's sister. You'll get in trouble." So I wasn't taken, so I ran home and told, well, I don't know if they got the police or who they got, but the girls were not hurt, and they were released. But it's funny that it helped to have 2 brothers, 2 older brothers. And my brothers played baseball and football with these kids, or with their older brothers probably. I don't think they were the older boys. We also had a bootlegger down there, and the kid took my brothers in and showed them where they hid all the illicit liquor. They had the frameway of the doors hollowed out, and they could fit it in there and places like that. Funny thing is, this one family, a man named Leo married into the Italian family, and I think the Italians were the bootleggers, and of course he became one too. But he had a brother who was a police captain. So I don't know how that worked out.
What was your parents' attitude towards prohibition?
My dad said, if it's the law, you obey it. I think he saw a great deal of what drinking and alcoholism could do to his friends and to people around him. And he was very careful of it. But he did make homemade wine, and the Italian people showed him how to make it, our Italian neighbors. But apparently he thought that was all right. I don't know. Well, he wasn't selling it.
Right.
And he'd just give it to people that came into the house. I don't think he drank it that much. He was a funny guy, as far as that was concerned. I think he had sown all his wild oats when he was younger. Maybe that's why he didn't get married until he was 30. Mm-hmm. And he did travel when he was younger in his job. And he used to tell us that's why people put ketchup on everything. Because when you traveled and got eggs, they weren't real fresh, and the ketchup made them taste better. So that's why you put ketchup on everything. Right? And I'm trying to think what else.
What about high school? What was high school like? You went to Girls High, which was down on... Where?
I went to Hallahan Catholic Girls High School that was down at 18th and Wood being one street above Vine.
Middle of North Philadelphia now. In North Philadelphia?
No, Center Philadelphia.
Oh, Center.
It was right on the Parkway.
Vine, right, okay.
Actually, while I was in high school, they were building a court building between us and the fountain down there. We had such a beautiful view the first couple years, and then we had construction for the next years. I loved it. I absolutely loved school. I was excited about what we learned. I was in the Glee Club when I was younger. You couldn't be in too many things at the same time. So probably in my sophomore and junior years, I was in the Glee Club. I wrote for the newspaper, and I wrote for the yearbook. When I was a senior, I was editor of the yearbook. And I had to give up the Glee Club because they said each one was all-consuming of your time. I had a wonderful moderator, a nun, and I had also had her for English. And she was one of those people who brought the English alive. She's one of those people who was up there reading something, maybe a dueling scene, and she was dueling all over the front of the classroom. And to this day, if I'm reading Shakespeare to get the most out of it, I have to get up and walk around. It means so much more to me if I do. Mm-hmm. And I find even some poetry. I guess it depends on the whether the tempo maybe of the poetry, the soft, dreamy stuff maybe I can sit still for. Mm-hmm. But I learned to love poetry, and I love to learn literature with her. I was a very good math student, and I was an honor student for 4 years. No, I was top honors for 3 years. The 4th year, I didn't have a 90 in business. I didn't like business, but I had 90 in everything else. Mm-hmm. So, and I won a scholarship to a place called Charles Mars Price, and it was for a slogan that I wrote. They had a contest and had a slogan, but I never went. I didn't get it.
Business school?
It was supposed to be an advertising school. Oh. Yeah, but I didn't take it.
So what did you, after high school, you graduated at 18, what, 1939?
Yes, I graduated in 39 and there was nothing. I went around every place, nothing. So I stayed home for the summer, and I started to look again in the fall. And one day I was home and my mother was out, and I got a phone call from a classmate, and she said, are you interested in a job? I said, of course I am. She said, well, come down here to the Philadelphia Record. My uncle is placement manager. So I went down and I got a job, but I was in the accounting department, accounts receivable, and it was a dumb kind of job. And the next thing I knew, they put me in the circulation department on a bookkeeping machine, which I despised. And the next thing I know, they said, we need a secretary up in the city room. But they wanted somebody, they already had one, but they wanted somebody to fill in for her or something. And I ended up working Saturday until maybe 6 o'clock at night and having Monday off. And but it was great. You were one girl with like 100 men in the city room. I don't know if there were 100, but there seemed that many. And I was right by the publisher, J. David Stern, had his office, and then the managing editor and the senior editor and some other editor were along the front. And then all these guys in the city room with the city editor. And, of course, I had guys that were making a play for me. One in particular, he was only a copy boy, and he was the most obnoxious thing I've ever seen. So all the other men were protecting me against the ones that were obnoxious. They treated me like a kid sister, really. And some of them treated me like a daughter. And then I got talking to this one guy, and I didn't know whether he was married or what he was. I just talked to him. And then he was kidding around about a date to go sledding. Oh, sure. He never showed up. But then finally he did tell me that he was coming. And it turned out it was your father. It was, he came over. He didn't have a car. He lived in Germantown. I lived in Oak Lane. And he had to take a trolley to come. And then we walked to the movies in the snow. We walked home again. And then he had to take a trolley again. And we dated. First date was March 8th, my dad's birthday. Elizabeth's birthday. And we dated about every week or 10 days. And so next thing I knew, he was saying, when we get married. And I thought, what's he talking about? Wait a minute. Because he was with me for my 20th birthday. We went to church. It was Holy Thursday, and you had to go visit 3 churches. We went and visited 3 churches. And then his friend and he came back to my house with my friends, and my mother had cake and ice cream. So that was my 20th birthday.
He was an older man, too.
He was an older man, yes. He was 6 years older.
After your father robbed the cradle, what did your mother think of...
Well, my mother didn't think anything, but my mother-in-law-to-be thought he was robbing the cradle. So I thought he was younger, and he thought I was older than I was. So I must have been sophisticated. I truly wasn't sophisticated, but I think I knew enough to keep my mouth shut, which made you seem older. Mm-hmm. And but I didn't want people at work to know that we were dating because they could be nasty. People, they're probably still nasty about people at work dating. And there was one man, he was a photographer, a Jewish man, Mike Perlman, and I don't know how he knew, but he was so funny because he thought he was so special because he knew. Nobody else knew. So, and then I went to a big union party with your father, and I think gradually it came out. But I left the paper and went to work for a bank. It was more money, and it was, I didn't have to work Saturday till 6 o'clock, which didn't matter because your father was a district reporter and he had horrible hours.
Right.
He was working nights, and he would be working district out in West Philadelphia, which was a lot different then than it is now. But even then it was kind of wilder than the rest of the city. And I would go out a lot of times and have dinner with him. And he'd bring me into a bus stand, and then I'd take a bus home the rest of the way. My younger brother did not care for that. He didn't think I should be traveling around by myself. So, but, then the war came. And
How early were you aware of the sort of coming war, and what were people's attitudes?
I don't think we were too aware of it. We had friends, your father had a friend in particular, who was drafted. And drafted almost, well, they were drafted and would have been out. They were drafted a year before the war started. Mm-hmm. And the one man was sent to Alaska. And he practiced with broomsticks or what have you. Right. You know? And so I used to write a newsletter to all your father's friends when he finally went in. But I wasn't too aware of the war. I had friends who were over in Hawaii, two brothers, and they had gone in the service before we thought much about it going to be a war. In fact, they were both sergeants, and they were country boys. They were up early, and they were up going to Mass. And they were walking back to Fort Schaffner and saw the Japs bombing it. And they both came through the war. And of course, by that time, they were teaching the other men. They were experienced soldiers compared to the others just coming in. So, but we were home making cookies to send to them for Christmas. And it came over the radio about Pearl Harbor. So
Sunday morning, wasn't it?
No, it was Sunday afternoon.
Sunday afternoon, the news came out.
And your father called me. He was working, and he called to get some information about the friends I had over there. Of course, they were interviewing all the families.
Right.
And this one man was there, a friend of my brother's, Jim Harkins, who was a very good friend of mine too, but he was my brother's age. And he was being real crazy and everything. He always was. And he was stealing the cookies. He was eating the cookies. And Jim went into service. And he was in the artillery. No, not the artillery. He was in the infantry. And he was made a lieutenant. And his job was to force march troops to see how much ground they could travel in a short time. Mm-hmm. And so I think he was either first lieutenant or captain by the time he went overseas. And he went overseas in a boat, and Paul went over, my brother Paul. And Paul caught up to Jim's outfit. He knew what outfit he was in. He asked him about Lieutenant Harkins, was lieutenant. And they said, oh, he went over in the first boat. So a little bit later, it was at the Battle of the Bulge. Mm-hmm. Paul caught up to the outfit again. And Jim had been killed in Germany. And that was a sad thing. It was sad for me and for everybody because he was a real great guy. He had a tux, and he would tell me, don't forget, have tux, we'll travel. And I got tickets to Fantasia, when it first came, and they had a formal opening for that. And I took Jim, or Jim took me. So he had tux, and we traveled. But he was one of the ones I lost, and one of the ones I miss very much. These fellas come around our house, for years, friends of my brothers, and they were like brothers to me then too.
Right.
Yeah.
What was the I guess the overriding emotion was fear or anger or after Pearl Harbor?
Shock, I think, and then anger, and then fear. Yes. And then what can we do? And everybody had to do something that I didn't do much except the things that everybody did, We went on rations and we saved this and saved that. Some people cheated. There are always people who cheat and do black market things, and we look down our nose at them. And but I worked in the bank, and a lot of people went into defense work. They made a lot more money too. So, but I remember after I got married and had a child, children wear out shoes so fast. And we had stamps to get shoes. And my dad didn't wear his shoes out so fast. He'd give us the stamps and we'd use them for the babies, for the kids. Yeah. And of course they didn't use much sugar, so we gave it to him for his coffee.
When did you decide to get married?
Well, he sent me an engagement ring. He had gone into the service. He had gone to OCS to be an officer. And when he got his, he became a second lieutenant. And he sent me an engagement ring from Fort Sill, Oklahoma, by mail. We were engaged. And then he told me he was going to come home, and we were going to...
But he clearly knew that you were going to accept.
Yes. He had asked my parents.
Oh, okay.
He went through the whole formality to speak to my dad and mother.
How long had you been going out? So you started going out in 40? Or?
Well, we had my 20th birthday, then we had my 21st birthday together. And I was past 22 when we got married. But he was in service for a good bit of that time, for about almost a year before we got married.
So did he sign up pretty much right after, fairly soon after Pearl Harbor?
He waited because his parents were going to have their 50th wedding anniversary. And he waited for that. And then he went in. And he went and had his draft pushed up. And... of course, they all thought that the war wouldn't be over unless they got in it.
Right.
And he told me he was coming home from Fort Sill. He said to me, "We can get married." And I said, "No, we can't." So, anyway, he came home. He thought it'd be great if we got married. And I said, "No." So then he went back to Fort Sill. And then a while, I guess it was about 6 months.
Why did you say no?
I wasn't ready to get married. I was a little afraid, I don't really know what it boiled down to. And because it would mean marrying and he'd go away,
right.
So anyway, when I went down to visit him, he was sent to South Carolina. And I went down to visit him for a week or 10 days. And there were a lot of married couples among the officers. And we talked, and I guess by then I was accepting of it, that I could go and spend time with him before he went away. So we agreed to get married, and we asked the colonel if he could have time off to come home to get married. And the colonel said, "I'll give him time off, but if he comes back single, I'll court-martial him." He said, "He got to leave before to get married. Why didn't you marry him then?" I said I wasn't ready. So he came home. He came home of a Monday, and we got married on a Tuesday.
July 19th? July...
Well, I was 22. So it was 43.
It was 43. July, what was the date?
20th.
July 20th, 1943.
Yeah. And we went down to Atlantic City.
Where did you get married? Which church?
Oh, we were married at St. Benedict's. That was my parish church. And your father's best friend, Bud Murray, was the priest who married us. And
who was the best man and the maid of honor?
The best man was Ben, his nephew, Ben McCarthy. And the maid of honor, matron of honor, was my sister-in-law, Mary Donnelly, Jack's wife. And that's all we had. We had a small wedding party, but we had trouble we had a breakfast afterward. Well, it turned out to be lunch. In those days, you had to fast from midnight, and you get married at 10 o'clock.
Have communion.
And you were still hungry, and your father he wanted a cup of coffee, and we went to have pictures taken. And he was a pain in the neck. He kept telling me he wanted coffee, and I wanted pictures. We got pictures.
It was your day.
And then we went, and the only place my mother could get was this restaurant down at Broad and Erie. And we had to walk through at lunchtime, walk through a packed restaurant, right, to the back room. And but then they had a party that night at my parents' house. But he and I didn't stay for that. We took off in the afternoon, and we went to Atlantic City. And we went to one of the big hotels, but we were awakened at 6 o'clock the next morning with the Air Force sweeping the streets and singing the Air Force song. They were stationed down there. Mm-hmm. And he couldn't get a drink because there was no liquor served to men in uniform. And they wouldn't give me a drink because they knew I'd pass it to him. So we were down there until Thursday, which was 2 days. And we came home. We spent a little time with his family, some time with my family. And on Saturday, we got a coach to South Carolina. You set up in a coach. Mm-hmm. And it took longer because you could get sidetracked for troops to go by and everything. And then we were in South Carolina. We had a room for a while, and then we got an apartment. And we were together down there. That was July, and I think I came back in November, pregnant. Mm-hmm. So. What
was life on an army base in South Carolina like in your early days of World War II?
Well, they always wanted me to come out there to eat. Both the enlisted men and the officers, they loved to have a woman come there. And we kind of went more to the enlisted men because they had a cook who had been a chef in the Stacy Trent Hotel in Trenton. And the guys were all so nice. They were real nice. And then the colonel said we had to come and eat with them sometimes too. So we did. And Christmas time, I got sick because I had to eat something from everybody's box. And these Polish guys had all these things I never saw before. And I had to eat them and tell them how good they were and everything. And we had one sergeant who was getting married, and his wife-to-be came and stayed overnight with me. And then we were, bridesmaid and best man, your father and I. Mm-hmm. And they were nice guys. What
were the quarters like for you? Were you in married? Married officers' quarters?
No. We had a portion of a house, and actually it was a nice house. It was a banker's house, and his wife was renting out a portion, and a little porch, enclosed porch, was our living room, and one of the downstairs bedrooms was our bedroom, and the closet was our bathroom, and another closet was our kitchen. That was our apartment. And the first night I was in there, I set mouse traps because we had mice. And your father had to be out in the field overnight, so I was home alone. So when he finally got in, I told him I had caught 20 mice. And he said to me, 20 mice, he said. You're kidding me. I said, no, I'm not. Go out and count them. They're out in the garbage pail. And he said, but who baited the traps for you and opened the traps? I said, I did. He said, I have 7 sisters. None of them would do that. I said, none of them are alone here with all the mice.
Mice and cockroaches, huh?
Well, we didn't have cockroaches. We had ants. And I remember going to a great deal of trouble to open a coconut and shred it and put it on the kitchen table and go to the front door for something and come back. And the coconut, shredded coconut, was brown, and it looked like it had jimmies on it. It had ants. And I realized you couldn't leave anything out. You had to keep everything in the fridge. So it was, I never liked the idea of the South. I always figured they had too many bugs. And the wives, it was hot down there, and they didn't have air conditioning. And we didn't have shorts and holders in those days. And we'd play bridge, and we'd play in our slips. Well, these women gossip something horrible. And I'm not a gossip. I like a little bit, but not nasty stuff. And they were just too much for me. So I thought I have to find something else to do. So I went to the Red Cross, and they had rolling bandages. I thought, well, they say it. I guess it has to be done. I'll do it. Well, I met another girl, a young woman, who was my age, who had been married the same day I had been married, only she was married in Chicago, and she was married to a West Point man who was a major, and he was a major in your father's outfit. Her name was Mary Evelyn Sunloff. She was Catholic, so we had so much in common, and we really enjoyed one another's company, and she had a much nicer apartment than I did. Hers was over a garage, but it was beautiful. She also had a car, which I didn't have. And we got to be very good friends. And the funniest thing of all was when the major of my husband's outfit called me and told me that the women of the town were giving a tea in our honor, and she ordered me to attend. I didn't have to be ordered. I was delighted to go anywhere. And, of course, I put on my best dress, my best hat, my gloves, and I talked to Mary Evelyn, and she was going too, and she said, I have a ride. Come down to my house. We have a ride. So I went down to her house, and the car pulled up, and it was the general's wife. She was our ride. She was a lovely lady. So off we went. And there was a receiving line, and Mary Evelyn and the general's wife grabbed me and put me in the receiving line between them. And this major's wife came through, and she couldn't figure out who I was and what I was doing there. And I had a laugh. I was very happy because, she was horrible. She was a Trenton National Guard. Her husband was a colonel with them, and politician. Not very nice person, really. So I never played bridge again. I didn't like bridge, and I didn't like those people, and so. But Mary Evelyn and I became friends, and we went places together. Except when our husbands were with us, we couldn't. We could just say good morning.
Yeah, right. That's
yeah. And I remember one night we went to see Porgy and Bess. What a place to see it, Columbia, South Carolina. The black folks were up in the balcony, went in a different entrance, the whole thing, And it was wonderful. And when we came out, we decided to go to the Officers Club. So we went to the Officers Club. Well, we got in there, and so many of these guys tried to hit on us. If we got out, we figured we'd be in trouble if we got caught in there. So I remember being in there later with our husbands, and the guys kind of looking, haven't I met you before? But I told you, Dad. He said, you could have handled that. I said, yeah, I could have handled it. So could Mary Evelyn. But we decided there was no sense sticking our necks out.
So you came back to when Dad got transferred back to Oklahoma?
Yeah.
You came back to
I came home pregnant. I came home and I moved in with my dad and mom. And my sister-in-law, Mary, was already there because my brother was away in service and she was pregnant. So we used to be sitting out on the front porch when Jack would get home. He was stationed in Baltimore and got home often. And he used to say that we were the Florence Crittenden house. That's the house for the pregnant girls.
No.
And then he'd take us out and he'd say, both of them are mine. So she had her baby 6 weeks before I had mine. And a month before I had mine, your dad was injured.
How did you hear of that? What was...
Well, actually, he had been home. They didn't need any more field artillery men. And if he wanted to go overseas, they told him the only one thing they wanted at that point were engineers, combat engineers. So he had to go back to school down near Washington. And I was dying to go down, but the doctor wouldn't let me go because it was summer, it was hot, and travel was not good at all at that point. And they promised me that later they'd take me after I wasn't pregnant. So I got a phone call, and it was the Red Cross from the base where he was. He had been home.
Which base?
I'm sorry, he was home after he got out of engineering school. He was home for leave. And we had our first wedding anniversary. And then he went to Camp Chaffee, Arkansas. And he was only there a week. And I got a phone call to come at once. He was seriously ill. So...
Did they give you any detail?
Or? No. So I called Uncle Frank. And being a doctor, he called and he talked to the doctors. He found out what was going on. And he told me I was not to go. He said he's in a coma. He could be gone in a half hour. And then what are you going to do? You lose the baby on your way there. You have to make a decision. He said, I think at this point, your responsibility is to your unborn child. I said, okay. He said, I'll keep you informed. I'll talk to them and everything. And
this is Dad's brother.
This is Dad's brother, FX. And I went along with it because I had no choice, really. And I didn't talk to him. He didn't talk to me for about 6 weeks. Now, he came out of the coma. I knew that.
How long was he in the coma?
He was in the coma for about a week to 10 days, I would say. He came out of the coma and his speech was affected. And he was paralyzed on the right side. So anyway, when he called me, I'm trying to think back. The baby was born. My dad took me. Aunt Mary went with me. She was a special nurse. And I had David.
At Germantown Hospital.
At Chestnut Hill Hospital.
That's right.
And then I came home after 10 days. And he called me and talked to me, your father. I could hardly understand him. He sounded like someone who was retarded. He sounded horrible. And I got off the phone and I was a wreck. So, still I couldn't go. And I stayed with the baby.
What did he say?
I don't know what he said really now. I was just so upset.
Right.
And his colonel was wonderful. His colonel used to write to me 2 or 3 times a week and report on him. And sometimes even call me on the phone. And he told me, he said, he's going to get better. He's going to get better. He's coming along. And
So what was your, when when he was in the coma, I guess you thought that he could go at any time?
Yeah, I didn't know what to think. I didn't think he could go. This couldn't happen to him. This couldn't happen to us. And I guess I didn't accept it, really. And not seeing him made it easier not to accept, I guess. But travel was very bad then, because there were troop movements all over the country,
right,
and war goods moving by freight. So they didn't want somebody moving around. And as I say, I was kept in pretty close contact with him. Now, Bill Nolan, who lived up the street from me growing up and was a friend of my brother's, he had been over in Africa. He had been in Italy. And then he had been sent back to the States. And he was somewhere close enough to David to be able to travel quite a roundabout way to the hospital and see him. And he went to see him. And he told me that Daddy said he didn't want me to come. He didn't want me to come and see him. His teeth had been knocked out. His head had been shaved. He couldn't walk. He couldn't talk. And I was not to come until he told me. So there we are again. And Bill had come on when Jack was christened. So he came on, I guess. He saw David and then went back and told them. And they said he couldn't get in. He said, oh, yeah, I have to get in. I brought word back about his new baby. So then they let him in. And I didn't go. I wrote to him. I might have talked to him on the phone a few times. And Christmas time came, and he told me he was coming home for Christmas. So the accident was the end of August.
Right.
And it wasn't the end. It was the 7th, around the time he died. And he came home for Christmas. He came home, some soldier brought him home on a train and got off at Pittsburgh or New Kensington or someplace and dumped him someplace and then put him back on a train alone. And it was...
How was Dad traveling? Because was he in a wheelchair?
He had just gotten a brace. He had just gotten a brace.
So he was up walking.
So anyway, my father took me down to meet him. And it was rainy, icy, messy kind of night. And I went down to the railroad station and I thought, how am I ever going to get him into the car? So I went up to the MPs and told them my problem. And they said, we'll take care of it. So the train pulled in and they took a gurney out and had him sit on the gurney. And they pushed him all the way in and out to my dad's car, and practically these two great big guys, and he looked like a man 60 years old. He was so thin and so drawn looking. And they put him in the car, back seat of the car. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, now what? How do we get him out? Right. So my wonderful father drove us up Broad Street and drove us home. And he took us around to the back, and he said, I think the best way is to go in the cellar door. He doesn't have to go up steps outside. And once you're in there, there's dry stairs and a banister and everything. It might be easier. And it was. It was. And we got him home. But the next morning, he looked wonderful. Well, compared to what he had looked the night before.
Right.
And he informed me that he was going to go get a haircut up the corner. And I'm telling my mother and Mary, and the next thing you know, they disappeared. And I thought, where are they? So what am I going to do? He doesn't want me to go, and he's going to go. So I let him go. And I caught up to them, and I said, they were hiding down the cellar. And I said, what are you doing here? And they said we couldn't stand to see him come down those stairs without rushing to half carry him down. And we knew he didn't want it. So we decided the best thing for us to do was to hide. So he went and got a haircut. And it was unbelievable. But his speech had improved, but it wasn't perfect yet.
Right.
You know, he hesitated quite a bit. And of course his arm was paralyzed, his leg was paralyzed, his face was paralyzed, side of his face. Never receded completely from his face either.
No.
He had no wrinkles on one side.
Yeah.
And he had 10 days home, I think. So first he saw David, and David was 3 months old. And then we went over and visited his mother, his parents, his family. And your Uncle Jack drove us, and your Uncle Jack practically carried him up the steps of Penn Street. And I thought, oh dear.
Long steps up Penn Street.
Yeah, and he, after we got in, he thanked Jack. And he looked at me and he said, he only did it because he cares. I thought, okay. I'm glad you can think of it that way. He was very good that way. You know, he didn't take offense, or he knew how he was and that it was different. He often had children come along and ask him why he was walking with a cane. Why did he have a cane? He'd tell them why. So.
But did he go back into the hospital, or?
Well, he had to go back to the hospital, and I went with him.
To Arkansas, or?
No, he was going back to Springfield, Missouri.
Okay.
And I went back with him, and we got a room in a house out there, and he could stay with me. And then he'd have to go back in the hospital in the daytime.
For therapy?
For therapy or whatever. And I don't know how much therapy they gave. I don't know how much therapy they knew.
Yeah.
But the wonderful, wonderful thing about it all was the ward boys. You know, there weren't male nurses then. And they had these men who did practically everything the nurses do now, except probably didn't give them medications, I don't know, but moved them and everything like that. And kept up good company, too, you know. The guys were great. And I think that was a big help to them getting better. There were nurses, they were officers, they were in charge of the medications and what have you, but they certainly had a lot of help with these guys. And a woman who was pretty high up in the Red Cross, and her father was a general in the charge of this hospital. Her name was Ann Lonsdale. She became interested in him, and she's the one that got us a room in this house, and used to drive us back and forth to the hospital and everything. She was wonderful to us. And then I came home, and then he was transferred.
You took David with you, I guess?
No. I left David home with my mother and Mary. And then he was transferred to Atlantic City. They had a hospital in Atlantic City, England General Hospital. And he really didn't get much of any kind of care there. It was kind of a holding zone or whatever.
Did he have to be in a hospital? Why did he have to be in a hospital? Because
he wasn't discharged yet, and because he was incapacitated, and because they didn't know what to do with him. And Esther went down, his sister, and was riding with him in one of those rolling chairs on the boardwalk that the men push, and he had a seizure. And that was the first seizure he ever had. And he had several seizures after that. And I went down and visited him. And then he was discharged home. And he came home to my parents' house. And the veterans took over, and they gave him physical therapy. And they would check him out monthly or whatever, and they gave him medication for the seizures. He was on Dilantin and Phenobarb for the whole of his rest of his life. And he had 1 or 2 seizures after that. Horrible to see. I was always afraid he'd have it out somewhere, you know, but he didn't. He had them at home, the 2 that he had after what he had down in Atlantic City. And then they went away. I mean, well, they were controlled, actually. And
How much? What was sort of the prognosis when after he was injured? I know in the past I think you've said that doctors didn't expect him to do much, or there wasn't a lot of expectations for him to lead a normal life. Is that right, or
That's true. That's true. And he first they didn't expect him to live, and then when he came out of the coma, they didn't expect him to make too much progress toward a normal life, and we went to the veterans, and they evaluated him and gave him medication and what have you, and told him to come back in a certain length of time. Well, then Jane, his sister, who worked at Pennsylvania Hospital, talked to her boss, doctor, and he suggested seeing a neurologist named Dr. Alpers, who was out at the Institute of the Pennsylvania Hospital out in West Philadelphia. And we went out to see him, and he checked Daddy out, and we talked to a speech man. And the speech man gave me a course on how to deal with speech. And we used to spend time every day on it. And he would do certain exercise, and he would get therapy. But Dr. Alperts told him he'd do anything he wanted to do if he wanted to do it badly enough. And Daddy said, well, I play golf. And he said, of course you'll play golf if you want to. Do you want to play golf? The doctor said, I don't know how good you'll be, but I don't know how good I'd be either. But the doctor was wonderful, and he didn't charge us anything. And this speech therapist was wonderful. And we really put time in on it. We did it, worked with speech.
Was that the main impediment, was speech? Or, I mean, certainly he was paralyzed, but he seen if he could walk
To
up
him,
the
his speech was his main impediment, yes. You know, he was never a physical man anyway. And the spoken word he conquered, but he never really conquered the written word because he had expressive aphasia. And that was the way it acted with him. But now you ask the expectations. When I took Daddy down to the veterans the first time, they checked him out, evaluated him, and there was another young man there with his mother, another soldier. And they told me that this other man had exactly the same problems your father had. And sometime later, your father was driving himself to the veterans for his checkups. And this other young man was coming in with his mother. And he had not moved at all from that position that I first saw him, where your father had come along. He was driving a car. He was out by himself. He had gone back to school. He used to get mad at me because I butted in too much, you know. He'd be writing a paper, and I'd just say, oh, no, it's better to say, But he passed the subject, and it was an associate degree in library science.
Right. Yeah. What year was this that he went back?
Well, he finished when Brian was born. I was pregnant with Brian when he graduated. It was 2 or 3 year course.
So through the 40s, through the latter part of the 40s, it was pretty much rehabilitation.
Yeah, oh yes, yes. And when we first came out, he was on retirement pay. But he had only achieved first lieutenant. He had only been in the service 3 years, and he got a pittance, you know, and we were living on nothing. And just an arm in service, and he drove. And he told your father, sure, I'll take you out. So they went out, and your father got his driver's license. All he needed was an extension on the gas pedal, so that he could use his left foot rather than his right, and a knob on the steering wheel to help him turn. And he had to have automatic transmission, which was fairly new then and more expensive. And so anyway, we got a Pontiac, 1949 Pontiac, green. And he said to me, well, I'll have to learn to drive so we can get the car, but then you can drive me.
Did you have your license?
Oh, yes, I had my license from the time I was 16. And so I said, fine. But he drove himself downtown. He drove himself all over. He preferred city driving.
Uh-huh.
And, but it didn't stop him. And that was, we thought Kevin was our lucky coin. And it did make things easier. And of course we had Kevin, and then bango, we had Mary 2 years later, or less than 2 years. And oh, we had a girl. And I was so thrilled. Well, I was so thrilled when we had Kevin. We had a baby. And your brother David, he was so excited. He wouldn't let Kevin cry. When Kevin was in the coach or the bassinet crying, he would rock him and sing to him. And Kevin would stop crying.
David was 5 or 6 at the time.
Mm-hmm. David was 5.
When Kevin was born.
So then Mary came along, and I was thrilled to death, but I hardly got a chance to enjoy her. And the next thing you know, I'm pregnant again, and I'm spotting. I'm threatened with losing the baby. I ended up in the hospital for a few days. The doctor told me I couldn't pick her up. Your Aunt Edith came over for a short time and took care of her for me. And along came Sir Brian. But we were very worried about him because I had been spotting until, oh gosh, I think he was almost 6 months underway when I stopped spotting. And I had him, and they had a doctor there to check him out, make sure he was all right. He was fine. Mm-hmm. He was fine. So that was my big worry. That was my only worry, my only difficulty in carrying babies. So it did work out okay. But each one brought something. Mary came along, and we were delighted to have a little girl. And when Brian came along, we were delighted to have a baby, and a healthy one, right. You know? And you were our new house baby. Mm-hmm. I don't know what Paul was at this point.
What was the last baby?
He was tag along. He was good, but you were all good. I didn't have any trouble with you as babies. I enjoyed babies. I guess that was it.
Well, that was the thing to do. There were certainly, both in Abbotsford and then up on Boyer Street, unlike neighborhoods like this, or where a lot of the kids grow up now, and they were just packed with kids.
Yes, we had a lot of children, and Mount Airy was the place to be. We enjoyed it very much, but I wasn't pregnant when we bought that house in Mount Airy, but before we got in, I was. So 4 bedrooms for 5 children, and then suddenly, a little bit later, we had 6.
Right.
But now I look in those rooms and I think, how did we ever have 3 kids in that back bedroom? And you each had your own bed.
Yep.
But it worked. I don't think you suffered from it.
I don't think so either. But I wouldn't admit it if I did.
Yeah. Well, no, but it was good. And your father, I don't know what he did. The thing that amazed me was we used cloth diapers with great big safety pins. And he would diaper babies with one hand. And you'd just lie there and smile at him. And I'd go to change you, and you'd be all over. And I'd have a horrible time changing you with 2 hands. So, you sensed it, I guess. I don't know what it was. But he was good. He always felt that he had to do things because there was so much he didn't do. And first of all, he decided that he was going to do the bills. And he wasn't all that great on reconciling a checkbook. If he got into a problem, I had to help him straighten it out. But he wanted to do it, and then he would either wash the dishes and dry them, or he would bathe the babies, that would be. And you kids loved it when he bathed you. He'd tell you stories and everything. And you always helped him. so, so I think he had a good life, even though he had 30 years after he was injured, before he got the cancer.
Yeah.
So that was 30 years and 5 children, more than I might have had.
Yeah.
I have to think of it that way. It seems like a long time that he's gone. I don't like being a widow. I never did like being a widow. But there's nothing much I can do about it. I never saw anybody else I wanted to take on.
Well, you always seem to have the 30 years later, I mean, the sense is still that he is still your husband.
Yes, I think I do feel that way. Mentally, I think of him that way. I talk to him sometimes, especially when I drive past the cemetery where I never go in. I give him the dickens about things. Like when Brian lost his job right after they bought a new house, I drove past the cemetery and I looked in and said, "What's wrong with you? You don't have anything else to do. Why don't you take care of these things?" So I told Brian when I got up there. He said, "What did he say?" He said, "Mind your own business. Things will work out." Brian said, "I knew he'd say that."
Things did work out. In fact, losing that job was the best thing that...
Exactly.
One of the best things.
Isn't that funny? Yeah, it's so funny. But then I used to take a ride down to visit the aunts at Alden Park, and it was so difficult to park down there. But he had always gotten a parking spot on that hill going up to the front door. I never did. I was going down Wissahickon Avenue one afternoon, and I said, "How about getting me that parking spot for a change?" Darn if I didn't get it. But he only did it for me once.
What was his family? You talked about your family and you growing up. What do you know of his upbringing and his parents? Very different, very much a different generation from your parents.
Yes, they were middle class. I think they were kind of lace-curtain Irish. Mama had been an orphan, really, from the time she was 14. And she lived with an aunt, and I think they were fairly well-to-do. And then she had worked for the Chew family. In fact, she even went to Europe with them and postponed her marriage for a year. And her wedding ring had the date of the original date in the wedding ring. But she told Benzie he had to wait till she came back from Europe. And
so what year would this be that they got married? Must have been like...
they were married 50 years. It must have been 93 or something like that, yeah. And no, they were married 42. They were married 50 years. About 92. And they had, of course, 10 children. And their oldest were the twins. Frank and Ben were 23 years older than the youngest, who was David Justin. And then the girls were in between. There were 7 sisters. Mary, Agnes, Esther, Edith, Betty, Ursula. Did I forget anyone? Jane. And I think they grew up, well, they were in the 20s. And your father knew all the music and all the stories of the 20s and everything else from his sisters. He knew very little from his brothers because they were married now. He, in many ways, was spoiled. And in many ways, he had very strict upbringing.
How do you mean he was spoiled?
Well, they pampered him. In fact, one of his brothers-in-law said, John Shannon said to me one time, he said, I couldn't believe that guy was going to grow up to be such a nice guy, but he sure did. He said his sisters did everything they did to prevent it. But that was only a macho, I guess. Although your daddy tells me that they sent him to school in first grade looking like little Lord Fauntleroy, and he had to fight his way across the schoolyard, and he got to be the best fighter in the class. I don't think he was ever somebody that would take anything too much. He had a temper.
He had a temper like Brian.
Yeah, he had a temper, and but he was very good-hearted. And
you say he had a strict upbringing. You mean a strict Catholic or just strict?
Strict Catholic and strict in manners and dress and what have you, you know. And I'm sure he wasn't. Well, none of us were allowed to swear or use street language. You know, that was a no-no. And I think when he went in the Army, he had a problem. He didn't know the names of some parts of the body. I probably didn't know them either. I imagine you learn them very quickly. But you want to know something? It's a funny thing. He got in trouble mostly for fraternizing with the men. The men in his outfit really liked him, and he liked them. And he had trouble with this rank bit, you know. Mm-hmm. So, and he also had, he was not a bigot. Long before other people, he was more accepting of the races. Mm-hmm. And
did that come from his upbringing, do you think? Because that was certainly, again, a childhood memory of mine is how accepting he was of black people that moved on the street. Was that something that...
I don't know where it came from, to tell you the truth. I think a lot of it was his newspaper. Because, you know, we didn't know black people. I mean, we didn't come in contact with them. We didn't see them or anything else growing up. And when we went to the Record, there was a black man who was a reporter, and he was an excellent reporter. His name was Orrin Evans, and he used to have lunch with the other men in Horn Hardats or someplace. But if I were with him, he wouldn't sit with us because a white woman was sitting at the table, and certainly I didn't feel that way about him. He was a very polite, courtly man and very